Hello, everyone. It's great to see you all for this, well, annual, sometimes biannual, every other year, Gowland Public Lecture, which is organised by the Science and Religion Forum. My name is Mark Harris at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm the chair of SRF, and it's my privilege to chair the Gowland Lecture tonight. So I'll say a little bit about the Gowland Lecture as well as our speakers. Well, the Gowland Lectures have their origins in a separate science and religion organisation called the Christ and the Cosmos Initiative, which was founded by the Reverend Bill Gowland, who was a former chairman of the Methodist Conference. And that organisation eventually merged with SRF in 2003. And in order to keep their memory alive, we've always organised these lectures at our annual conference ever since, as they've always been kind of a key point in our year, or sometimes every other year, depending on the pattern of conferences. Now, before I introduce our Gowland lecturer this evening, just a few words about the way we'll operate this lecture. So we're starting now 7:30 UK time. We'll aim to finish at 9. Please, could you ask questions, make comments via the Q&A facility, but you'll see that at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Not the chat, the Q&A. And please feel free to do this as the lecture is going on. Don't hold back. Don't wait until the kind of designated Q&A bit at the end. What we will do is, as questions and comments appear in the Q&A, they'll be noted on a separate screen. So they might disappear from the Q&A. That doesn't mean they've been forgotten about or they're being ignored. It's just that they've been noted for when the time comes. So like I said, please use the Q&A facility to ask questions at any point as we're going on. Now, so tonight our Gowland lecture is Professor Susannah Cornwall at the University of Exeter. She is Associate Professor in Constructive Theologies at Exeter, and she's the Director of the Exeter Centre for Ethics and Practical Theology. Her recent research has focused on theology, sexuality, and gender diversity, and she's published a number of books in the area, including Unfamiliar Theology, Reconceiving Sex, Reproduction, and Generativity. She's also published Controversies in Queer Theology and Sex and Uncertainty in the Body of Christ, and she led the Modelling Transgender Spiritual Care Project in partnership with the West of England NHS Specialist Gender Identity Clinic. And she has a new book coming out with Cambridge University Press on constructive theology and gender variance. Now, before I give you her title and ask her to start, I want to also introduce to you the respondent who will be responding to Susannah, and that is Canon Rachel Mann, who's a priest, poet, and writer. She's published a memoir of growing up trans called Dazzling Darkness, which has recently been published as a second edition, revised. She's author of 11 books in total, and her theological writing has been shortlisted for the Michael Ramsey Prize, and her poetry highly commended in the Forward Prizes. She is a member of the Church of England's Theological Advisory Board at the Faith and Order Commission, and we'll very much look forward to hearing her response after Susannah has spoken. So with all of that introduction, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor Susannah Cornwall, who will speak with the title Transformative Creatures, Theology, Gender Diversity, and Human Identity. Susannah, it's great to have you with us. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you to the committee for the invitation. It's great to be with you all here this evening. And also I'd like to thank in advance Rachel for having agreed to be the respondent. Rachel has been such an inspiration to me in my work. And for any of you that don't already know her book, Dazzling Darkness, which Mark mentioned, I can heartily recommend it. Now, I'm hoping that I'm about to start sharing my screen. Could somebody just confirm that they can see the slides now? Great, thank you very much. So my title this evening, as Mark mentioned, is Transformative Creatures, Gender Diversity and Human Identity. And I'm going to come back to that image of transformativity, transformation, a little bit later on. What I want to say this evening is that some of those theologians who are perhaps more suspicious of the phenomenon of gender transition are suspicious because they suggest that perhaps it reflects a rejection of God's plan, a rejection of a divine blueprint for how God intends human beings to be. And sometimes theologians working from that sort of argument will use terms like divine plan, divine blueprint, to suggest that actually only gender identities which map onto biology in particular ways are licit. What I want to suggest this evening, though, is that sometimes positions like that may take too little account of the ways in which all of us, all of we ourselves as creatures, are indeed transformative. And I want to show that Christians can be understood as curators, not just recipients of our own lives and traditions. So being creaturely, being a creature, is something profoundly formative of being human, and yet we're also partners in our own becoming. What has formed us as creatures, what continues to form us, is itself multiple, mixed, and crosses boundaries. As formative creatures, humans have the capacity and indeed the peculiar power to set agendas for others, including non-human creatures. And with that comes a particular responsibility to exercise that power responsibly. In order to be truly formative of us as humans, including those humans who have gender variance, who are transgender, Christian constructive theology, I want to suggest, needs to properly take into account diversities of human embodied experience. Gender, I want to suggest, should be understood provisionally as something which we receive, but also something we shape and hone and make decisions about. If we understand gender variance through a lens of euphoria rather than dysphoria, as some commentators have suggested we should, there may be more scope to celebrate the variety of its manifestations. Later on in the lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about some correlations between trans identity and neurodiversity, and I'll suggest that that connection is a really important reminder that received wisdom is not always incontrovertible, and that minority reports can help to attune us to things we're so used to seeing and accepting that perhaps it no longer occurs to us to notice or interrogate them. So Christianity contains extensive resources for explicating devastating transformations. As recent theological engagements with some much earlier theological forebears show us, transformation recurs as a theme right across the Christian tradition. I've put a few examples here of some of those forebears within the Christian tradition who are interested in this image, interested in this work. For example, those who write about being transformed into the image and likeness of God. We see someone like Paul wrestling with ideas of grace and agency as he works out what it means for his identity to be profoundly changed. We see in lots and lots of the early theologians appeals to theosis, to deification, and there's been a recent resurgence in interest in theosis in particular. We see appeals to transformation towards virtue, and in someone like Schleiermacher, to humans' own transformative capacities via their self-recognition and self-direction. In all of those instances, there is a tension, and that's a tension between how far such transformation depends on the work of God and how far it depends on human agency and initiative. And also a tension between how far our identities are constituted by we ourselves and how far they're constituted by and in our communities. But across the tradition, even when identity in general is understood as changeable and transformable in God, sex has often seemed like more of a non-negotiable, not just an accident of creation, but something that speaks to something really key about our ontology. And just because these resources exist within the tradition doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is always comfortable moving beyond accounts based in binary gender. But there is also space in the tradition for understanding Christianity as being more inherently about ongoing unfoldings of identity, continuing appeals to transformation. Another trans theologian whose work I admire very much and whose work some of you may know is Alex Clare Young, who has recently written of their conviction that it's precisely in and through their gender identity that they have a deeper understanding of the vocation to which all Christians are called. For Alex Clare Young, this is highlighted by their own non-binary journey, which has led them to hold that their refusal to settle in a fixed identity has given them particular capacity to love and minister to others and to appreciate that all identities are ultimately in flux. So shifts in identity, even what may look like quite drastic ones, needn't be figured as alien to Christianity. Indeed, there are affinities between gender transition and ruptures from and breaks with former identities experienced by those who undergo religious conversions, for example. Despite the obsessions with surgery and gory details with which media coverage of gender transition is often replete, gender transition is habitually somewhat less violent than religious conversion, although trans people and religious converts alike frequently find themselves at the very sharp end of retaliatory violence from those who object to their transformations. Matthias Wirth, who's written extensively on Christianity and transition, both in English and in German, suggests that gender transition might fruitfully be analysed alongside religious conversion. Both phenomena imply the cessation of one identity in favour of another, and yet Christians don't tend to be quite as suspicious of converts to their faith as much as some Christians are of trans people. For Matthias Wirth, conversion is evidence that Christians don't actually consider identity fixed or monolithic. Now, of course, one of the difficulties with an account like this is that many trans people experience their transition as an act of continuity, not an act of severance. That is, that they are only now expressing who they always were. Many friends and relatives of people who transition clearly do experience someone's transition as severance and often as loss. This might be understood as a kind of clash of autonomies, that of the trans person and that of those who love them and are invested in them. That's even starker, I think, when it's presented as a clash of goods or a clash of truths, as for example, when someone says that their autonomy to tell what they see as the truth about a trans person's sex is not being respected, and it becomes a matter of whose goods trump whose. As Matthias Wirth himself notes, there are forms of understanding of conversion that are about return to an original primal state, which for some reason had not been able to be fully expressed or realised, but was nonetheless always present. But this seems to undermine the extent to which conversion, whether gender conversion or religious conversion, is freely chosen. But Wirth is right, I think, that there are ways in which gender transition and religious conversion have striking parallels. Both are simultaneously public and private. Both involve acknowledging endings as well as beginnings. Both involve the volition of the agent as well as acceptance of something external, some kind of external power that is at work. Both appeal to a new identity in its fullness, and yet may also recognise that it needs to be grown into as well. And of course, not insignificantly, conversion does sometimes involve physical changes to the body, notably via male circumcision in converts to Judaism or Islam. The thing about conversions is that they can happen in various directions, into and out of particular traditions. In terms of religious conversion, there will always be some who don't accept the truth of the individual's new reality. It's rare, though not unheard of, for converts to return to their original faiths, or we might say to detransition. The fact of the return, though, needn't undermine either the reality of the conversion experience while it was happening, nor the goodness of the time spent exploring or avowing a different identity from the one the individual ultimately comes to profess. Conversion is also a really important image for Regina Amict Quinn, also writing about gender transition, who notes that conversion can fruitfully mean a turning away from certainty, including the certainty that a given individual is always and forever a man or a woman, or that body, gender, identity, and desire must fit together only in expected ways. And indeed, Quinn herself says that Christianity needs to be converted towards faith in a God who's greater than human attempts to maintain order. Indeed, she uses the image of being converted towards a grand creative disorder. We see this also elsewhere. I put up quite a long quotation here from John Henry Newman, which I won't read out in full, but it's up there for you. And I'll just read the last couple of lines. Newman is talking about the development of ideas, the strange territory that ideas might sometimes find themselves traversing. He talks about the idea of kind of false starts, or little journeys off down a road, and where someone then finds that that wasn't ultimately where they wanted to go. But I'll come to this last couple of lines. Newman argues that the idea might change with someone in order to remain the same. It might change according to the principles and the forms it's encountering in order to remain the same. In a higher world, he says, it is otherwise, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Now, Newman is not a theologian with whom I find affinity in every respect, but I'm really drawn to his description of the growth and expansion of ideas. And I think this is instructive for us and has wider application. There is no shame in having changed one's mind. Indeed, to have done so might be deemed to have exposed an emergent idea or conviction to proper scrutiny, weighing and testing how it sits within one's conceptual universe. It's significant, I think, that within the Christian tradition, there's been a long-lasting commitment to body, soul, spirit unity. And indeed, it's on the grounds of appeals to that unity that some of those Christian theological and ethical commentators who are a little bit more circumspect about gender transition as a good have held that gender transition is less than ideal in some way, since it seems to set up or reinforce a possibility of separating them. And yet it's also possible to hold to the idea of body, soul, spirit unity from a trans-affirming perspective, and to hold with such theological forebears as St. Macrina that body and soul unfold together, that the soul animates and nourishes the body without being separable from it. There are a couple of implications which proceed from that. One is that a soul which doesn't nourish a particular body, but which renders life in that particular body unlivable, is a sick soul. Now, Mark Yarhouse, whose work some of you will know, who is a clinical psychologist and psychiatrist, might say that the best therapeutic approach for a trans person is to treat their soul until it is no longer sick, so that the person can come to live peaceably in their unchanged body. We could say conversely, though, that perhaps the sickness lies not in the soul as such, but in its lack of fitness for a particular body. Second, it's questionable, I think, whether we can appeal to such a thing as a soul self that precedes the body in order to justify not making changes to the body. That is, whether we can justly argue that a trans person seeking, for example, to make a biologically female body male is betraying a real female self. E. Brown Dewhurst is a scholar who's done some work on Macrina recently, and draws on Macrina's work and also that of her brother Gregory of Nyssa, who many of you will know is also interested by the way that body and soul together constitute the self, and on Gregory's musings about which body it is that represents the real self in a world of physical transience, change and decay. If the resurrected body bears little or no resemblance to any of the manifestations of the bodies we've had on earth, says Gregory, how will we know ourselves in the new creation? How will we recognize ourselves? And if we don't, how far are our resurrected selves really in continuity with our present embodied selves? Well, Macrina's response is that attachment to any manifestation of the body before the resurrection is attachment to personhood under the effects of evil. So again, I've put up a longish quotation here from E. Brown Dewhurst, which I won't read, but it is here for you. Where Brown Dewhurst concludes is to say that in Macrina and in Gregory, there is this appeal to the wholeness of us as persons, even when the changes of the world take their toll on us. Now, we need to bear in mind that when this exchange between Macrina and her brother takes place, she's on her deathbed. She's very near death at the time. Perhaps it's unsurprising then that hopes for a body beyond the ravages of physical pain and suffering are going to be appealing, and also appeals to the idea that the true self isn't limited by such disfigurements in time. But as Brown Dewhurst notes, Macrina's account of true human nature is strikingly detached from many of the manifestations in which identity is commonly held to be most authentically expressed, such as sexual relationship and birth, for example. We also, I think, might want to push back a little at the idea that impermanence and transience are inherent ills. Appeals to goods such as permanence, faithfulness, stability are familiar both in theological discourse and in discourses underlying social cohesion. And it's one of the reasons why in many jurisdictions, people who do transition gender are required to swear that they intend the change to be permanent. But both those commentators who are affirming of gender transition and those who are more circumspect about gender transition might be able to share a conviction that there are times when uncertainty and fluidity are precisely a positive thing, as for example when a very young gender variant child expresses a desire to explore social transition, but where the question of whether that will turn out to be a permanent change is left open for a time. Macrina's account helps us to make sense of the ways in which we can simultaneously experience attachment to and detachment from our bodies. If it's possible to conceive of an embodied human nature unravaged by sin, perhaps we don't need to be overly attached to our bodies as they are now. And yet we can still affirm that there is something about our embodiment which is inextricable from our experience of selfhood. Our ends as humans, our destinies, our goals, can't, I think, be understood in any uncomplicated sense as being ahead of us, any more than the truth about us can be found in a once and for all, over and done with moment of creation. The goods to which we aspire as humans are not only the ones that we can't quite grasp yet, the ones in a mystic future time that may not come, but also those that we build here and now, in continuity with and discontinuity from what we've already been and what we may yet be. Many of you will know Alistair McFadden's work in theological anthropology, and he's written about Imago Dei, the image of God, very, very extensively. And one of the things he suggests, which is really fruitful, I think, is that the idea of Imago Dei should be understood performatively and indicatively rather than imperatively, not as communicating something static about humans, but communicating something active and something dynamic. So I want to suggest that our nature as humans, including our sexed nature, is not over and done with. It can't be invoked independent of the context in which that invocation is happening. Human life is being lived out in that particular context. So in that sense, our active building, our active shaping of our identities, and our body stories isn't a rejection of a divine blueprint for human existence. It's not an exercise of illegitimate human hubris, but rather a licitly creaturely form of generativity. So that's part one of the lecture. Now I'm going to change gear slightly, but I hope that by the end you'll see how all of this comes together. In this next part of the lecture, I want to turn to questions about the extent to which transforming our perspective allows us to attune ourselves differently to what constitutes health. Querying the taken for granted doesn't need to signify brokenness or inadequacy. Rather, coming at things from a new angle can allow us to appreciate a broader range of perspectives on normality and help us to understand that what are taken as granted as goods for a majority don't necessarily function in that way universally. So now I want to come on to thinking about some of these apparent correlations between trans identity or gender diversity and various types of neurodiversity. And there's been a lot of work in particular about apparent connections with autism, or people having noticed that there seem to be clusters of people who experience gender diversity and who are somewhere on the autism spectrum. Now, there are various explanations that have been offered about that correlation, various theories for why that might be. Some of those theories end up pathologizing either gender diversity or neurodiversity or both. So I'm not always particularly helpful, but I want to put some of them out there for us to think about a little bit. One explanation that has been offered is that autistic people, these are not my words, this is me glossing someone's argument. The idea that autistic people have an impaired capacity for empathy, which it is argued might decrease the likelihood that they will live with an uncomfortable gender role simply for the sake of the comfort of others. There is also a related suggestion that autistic people who often seek clarity and precision may be more invested than neurotypical people in finding precise gender categories that do justice to their identity. Jordan Jack, who's researched in this area, argues that gender as a social and rhetorical system goes hand in hand with other such social and rhetorical systems, and that those who find themselves rejecting other such systems may consciously or unconsciously reject binary gender constructs too, such that, says Jack, individuals with autism may not recognize gender in the first place or may learn to do so later in life. Gabrielle and Sarah and Peter Hegarty, working in psychology, argue that people on the autism spectrum who tend to be very, very conscious of things which seem to them to be illogical, unjust or unclear, might simply have less tolerance than other people for letting what appear to them to be arbitrary social norms, including gender conventions, go unchallenged. As a corollary, autistic people may be more willing to disclose their gender variance, less reserved about seeking medical intervention for gender diversity than neurotypical people are. And some researchers have suggested that is because neurotypical people are more in thrall to social norms. Laura Jacobs and her colleagues, and I should have said all these references will be at the end of the PowerPoint, and I'll make this available afterwards, so you will be able to follow up on these references if you want to. Laura Jacobs and colleagues, writing in 2014, argue that there may be a tendency among autistic people to be impatient about ambiguity, in tandem with what they describe as a propensity to hold to very rigid ideas. And they suggest that might make it harder for autistic people to form binary gender identities if they're keenly aware that aspects of their own behaviour and interests are not usually associated with someone of their sex. So, suggests Jacobs, if female children have an overly fixed view of what girls should be like, they may conclude that since they don't feel that way, they can't really be a girl. So there's lots and lots of work that's being done in this area, lots of questions about the order in which these clusterings might come in. So is it that someone already has a tendency to experience gender dysphoria, and that what look like autistic traits map onto that? Or is it that people who are on the autism spectrum to some extent perhaps are more likely to seek out gender diverse people? There are some scholars who suggest that this possible link between autism and gender diversity has been overstated, and suggest that actually this is simply about similar manifestations of particular characteristics that perhaps get misread or misinterpreted. So Turban and Van Schilwick, for example, say that just because you might sometimes wish that you were the opposite sex, maybe because you know that your interests are usually associated with people of the opposite sex, that doesn't necessarily constitute gender dysphoria. Rather, it might signal frustration or distaste about the social limitations placed on one's own sex. So lots and lots of suggestions here, but I think what we could say is that almost regardless of what's going on, perhaps it's not surprising that social relationships might be impeded or might be understood as having been impeded when someone has suffered stress, rejection, and bullying, whether on the grounds of gender or on the grounds of neurodiversity. Advocates for autistic people frequently emphasize the idea that actually neurodiversity is an integral part of the individual. It's not meaningful to try and conceive of an autistic person without autism. It's kind of baked in. Someone's autistic characteristics are part of who they are, not something that could be removed without changing their personhood. That, of course, has got important implications for theologies of eschatology and resurrection identity, perhaps even more so than the significant extant theological work which many of you will know on disability and dementia and so on. Neurodiversities like autism are, some people would argue, as much of a superpower as an impairment. The theologian Dirk Evers argues that actually, given that autism can be an objective burden to human lives, given that there may be human-made causes for autism which should better be avoided, nobody should construct autism as uniformly non-pathological. On the other hand, he says, nobody is in a position to draw a clear boundary between autism that is non-pathological and autism that is pathological. The individual must have priority. Whether or not it can be demonstrated that trans identity and a neurodiversity like autism are related to each other in terms of causation, the notable overlap between the individuals experiencing them makes the correlation worthy of further reflection. There are particular areas of potential from the neurodiversity movement which are helpful, I think, in finding constructive ways forward for theological accounts of variant gender. One is its keen recognition that norms of illness, pathology, functionality, and health are deeply cultured and contingent, and as Dirk Evers glosses, are far too often not in accordance with human dignity and self-fulfillment, but serve political, ideological, religious, or economic goals. Another really useful thing within neurodiversity discourse is the highlighting of the ways in which diagnosis and management can become ways of disappearing or selecting out particular pathologized differences. Additionally, neurodiversity advocacy notes the importance of people's right to make decisions on their own behalf, even when their condition may call their competence into question. It includes the right to make mistakes. In other words, even well-motivated attempts to protect people who are deemed vulnerable are not, of course, immune from patterns of paternalism or control. So Dirk Evers persuasively holds that in a cultural context where categories of normality and health are recognised as constructed, contested, and plural, human nature is best understood as a series of variants, more or less amenable to being fed into the good life. In terms of theological anthropology, he suggests human identity is not given and sewn up, but it's a calling in response to which humans develop. So this is not an answer for us as Christians about how to judge what is and is not good or desirable. It doesn't necessarily help us negotiate where to set the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable variation, but perhaps it will inform how we approach making judgments about those questions. Dirk Evers holds that just like the God in whose image they're made, humans are indefinite and indeterminate. The image of God doesn't rest in particular abilities or genders or sexualities, but rather in humans' existence as grounded in God. So for Evers, being created is not the same as being designed and produced. Existence is a calling and not a given property. The biblical creation accounts don't assume that creation is an end, but rather a beginning. And what all of this means for Evers is that an unusual mental condition may be experienced as a burden, a challenge to oneself and others, but it must not be seen as a defect, failure, deformity, or in a religious perspective, deviance from the will of a creator. And indeed, Evers has pointed to implications for links with trans theologies. He usefully outlines a trans theological anthropology of gender as emerging, unfolding, a lifelong vocation to be explored. He emphasizes humans' nature as self-interpreting animals. He describes humans as sense-making creatures who seek reason and purpose, but also experience our choices as constrained and not totally free. Another scholar who I just want to highlight briefly because I find her work so helpful when discussing this area and thinking about some possible connections between gender diversity and neurodiversity is Melanie Yergo, who describes this through the lens of what she calls neuroqueerness. I think this is particularly helpful, particularly given that she is someone who figures autism as conscious identity rather than involuntary impairment or deficit. She argues that like trans people and like other LGBTQI people, autistic people frequently experience being denied the agency to be the primary authorities on their own lives and experiences, and their capacity for licit expression is frequently undermined. Just like trans people, autistic people frequently have to think hard about whether to disclose their status, largely because they may be aware that if they do so, others may rush in to populate that label with meaning, not trusting the person to be able to do so reliably themselves. Yergo figures autistic people not as those who cannot fit into neurotypical modes of speech, action, and behavior, but as those who consciously reject them because they are oriented towards something else. And again, there we can see some parallels with trans people, more specifically, neurodiverse or not, who've actively chosen not to live within or not to perpetuate what they understand as problematic or fatally compromised sex gender systems. Holding that someone is a certain way, be it autistic or trans or gay, because they can't help it, does its own violence. It paints such an identity as so undesirable, so unthinkable, so abject, that no one in their right mind could possibly choose it. The next step for Yergo is a really crucial one, and that is where such an identity or behaviour can be represented as involuntary, it can all too quickly be characterised as less than human, where humanness is too quickly associated with rationality, agency, and intentionality. So to begin to draw to a close, it is formative of us as persons that we are creatures. That's part of what constitutes us. But being creaturely, as I suggested earlier, doesn't diminish our capacity for creation and generation in our own right. Many trans people are onto something in the way that they describe the emergence of their identities. And what they're onto is a reminder that actually we're more powerful as creatures than we've dared to know. That certain of the limits we have as humans persist in large part because we commonly accede to them, rather than because there could be no other way. Although gender transition as a phenomenon is often accused of commodifying and capitalizing on bodies and their enhancement, there's a sense in which gender transition is profoundly anti-capitalist. It refuses the dogma that there is no alternative to the systems in which we currently find ourselves. So there are many senses I want to suggest in which we are transformative creatures. We're transformative creatures with the agency and capacity that that implies, as well as inheritors of certain cultural scripts which we've been handed for better or worse. We are transformative in the sense that what has formed us, what continues to form us, is multiple, is boundary crossing in the sense of moving from one thing to another. We are also transformative in the sense that we do have peculiar power and agenda setting capacities for others, forming them as well as ourselves in the process. Trans and gender variant people, no more or less than others, after all, are on a journey towards perfection. Some versions of the General Confession from the Book of Common Prayer used in Anglican churches hold that on the grounds of our various sins of commission and omission, there is no health in us. In this time between the times that we are living in, we're frequently conscious of the ways in which our bodies and souls and spirits tire and struggle, exacerbated by illness, depression, or injury. The root of the term as used in the Book of Common Prayer gives us words for health in this sense, mental, physical, and spiritual, but also for wholeness and indeed holiness. Thus, of course, can health be a synonym for salvation? Now, some versions of the Book of Common Prayer omit this phrase, perhaps because it seems overly condemnatory, perhaps it even seems to diminish the efficacy of divine grace. What I want to suggest is that in Christ, everything has changed, even that which appears to have stayed the same, perhaps. In Christ, everything has changed. So the way that things may appear to be doesn't necessarily map easily onto the way things actually are. This is not to dismiss or diminish our conventions around things like sex and gender. Those are our precious, often our dearly held ways of muddling through our world. But if there is no health in us, then there is nothing so perfect that it does not require redemption in and through Christ. There's nothing that Christ's saving work and grace doesn't touch, because there was nothing that was not caught up in the web of sin and therefore not in need of redemption. This is really, really important when it comes to sex and gender, because the story that we often hear is so compelling. It often seems so obvious, so self-evident that there are two types of humans with two types of sexed bodies, that by and large as societies, we organize ourselves in that way. Yet in Christ, everything has changed, even that which seems to have stayed the same. Our legacy no longer, if it ever did, requires us to leave behind children. We can perhaps sit lighter than we could to the self-protective, demarcating work that binary sex and gender used to do for us. In Christ, sex and gender don't need to be predicated on fear or threat or lack. They are a new creation. The old has gone and the new has come. To stay with 2 Corinthians for a moment, many trans people, just like many non-trans cisgender people, will find their present state painful. They will long to cast off their earthly tent. But as creatures, we may experience our bodies as burdensome and long for a time when they will no longer be sources of pain. But our bodies, which have already been made anew, still have yet another transformation to come, an entry into a yet more perfected form. Those who currently feel at home in their bodies and those who currently feel alienated from their bodies may both and alike hope for and look to this transfiguration. And as one reading of Paul hints, it may be that those currently most at home in their bodies, that is, those who currently experience no gender dysphoria, can't really understand how anyone else could either, who are least able to walk by faith, because they're least aware of the disjunction between transfigured bodies and their earlier versions. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:16, "From now on, we regard no one from a human point of view, according to the flesh." That includes our regard for Christ himself. We know him no longer in that way, says Paul. So perhaps we need not cling to these bodies. We need not relate to God in Christ in these bodies as we used to understand them. We may be called to let go, especially perhaps, of the notion that our ontology is grounded in our biology. Our outer nature, after all, is wasting away, even as our inner nature is being renewed. Because, again, this is 2 Corinthians, we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. Trans people whose identity, agency, and capacity for self-knowledge are frequently treated with suspicion might justly feel, with Paul and Timothy, that they are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. You've heard plenty from me, so I'm going to leave that there. I will quickly go onto the slides with the references, but I will make sure that these are available for you afterwards. I'm going to turn my camera off, and I believe that I am now handing over to Rachel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susannah. I'm just stepping in, just in between. Sorry, I think I was muted there. I'm just stepping in, just introducing Rachel. Looks like, Rachel, you're ready to go. Is that right?
Insofar as I'm ever likely to be ready to go.
In that case, as Susannah shows us her references, please feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Susannah. And curiously, there's a part of me that just simply wants to sit in silence in reception of what Susannah has shared with us. I feel that she has taken us pretty deep into what I can only call this living work of being human. And I am immensely grateful for her generosity and wisdom tonight. There are so many places in that which Susannah has shared that I might start. Where I want to start is right at the end and then go right back to the beginning. I feel there's something deeply religious about the beginning and the end, the Alpha and Omega coming together at the end. Susannah uses that extraordinary phrase from the BCP, there is no health in us. And I want you to hold that alongside this, I think this extraordinary claim right in the opening paragraph. Christians can be understood as curators, not just receivers of our own lives and traditions. And I want to explore what this notion of curation in relation to health and formation might mean. I guess I want to draw out some threads in what I've heard Susannah say. Curation, it's one of those words that I have to say personally, I found has become something of a buzzword. I mean, everything gets curated these days. People say, I'm curating my coffee shop. And there's a sense in which it's become a rather trendy term. This notion of keeping, of being the custodian, of being in charge of something. And of course, it's a term which we commonly and historically relate to galleries and museums, that idea of the museum curator. But now we've become curators so often of ourselves, of our digital selves, of our identities. But of course, there's a beautiful etymological twist here in the notion of, well, these cognates of cure and curate, which is a term that those of us in the Church of England are very familiar with. Whether one is an assistant curate or me as a rector, I am a curate. I share a cure of souls with the bishop. And this sense of cure, of curation as taking care of, to be participants in healing. And there is no health in us. And yet, as Susannah reminds us, this work of being human is an invitation, I think, into growing into the likeness of Christ. a kind of theosis, as she gestures towards, of, dare I say it, being cured, of being held, of holding ourselves and holding others in community, where the facts of us, in our limitations, in our precariousness, which Susannah so beautifully brings out, meet the promise of God. So perhaps curate, to be a curator, is far from a static metaphor. And I think it's something which really would welcome further development, and I think is a really refreshing contribution to our conversations around trans, gender diverse, neurodiverse identities, and one which is challenging me to go deeper and further as a trans person and as a theologian. But where is God in this? Where is God's givenness? Where is givenness, the God-givenness in all of this? And this is where I want to be a little bit naughty, and I did warn Susannah that I was going to do this, or likely do this. I'm going to read a little bit from John's Gospel and then respond to it with a thought from William Temple, because I think it helps us reflect on those people who want to say that gender diverse or neurodiverse people are problems, or say, well, where is God, given that we are given bodies, and shouldn't we be faithful to them? And this passage from John's Gospel goes like this. It's very familiar. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go, ye know, and the way ye know. And William Temple is really helpful in reminding us that this word that we use, mansion, in my Father's house many mansions, which has a sense of stasis to it, is actually in the Greek being monai, it means resting places. And in classical culture, those resting places are part of perhaps a caravan, a pilgrimage, in which someone would be sent out from the resting place ahead to the next resting place. Perhaps an interpreter to make way for those who come after, to speed the path, to break the strange and unfamiliar ground for those who are travelling. And it seems to me that there is something profoundly beautiful and mysterious in what Susannah, I think, is certainly what I heard in Susannah talking about mystery, and this sense of God doing the work of going ahead, being the way, of being the interpreter who makes the resting place in the pilgrimage prepared for all of us, so that all of our identities, whether we are neurodiverse or gender diverse or not, have this sense of being open to transformation and being gathered up into the God who travels on and travels ahead. So there is this living work of being human, which I think is just extraordinarily beautifully brought out in what Susannah has shared with us tonight, and suggesting, if I can put it in terms which, you know, I'm a bear of little brain, and I put it this way, about becoming who we are. And I want you to hear the tense in that, the way in which there's a becoming who we are. And that kind of work, that vocation, which I think trans people, gender diverse, neurodiverse, have a particular kind of gifting in to reveal to us. And as Susannah, I think, reminds us so helpfully, that there is this conversation, this dialogue, and dare I say it, to go back to this idea of in my Father's house there are many mansions, this indwellingness between trans identities and Christian identities. I'm a poet, so I tend to make up absurd phrases. And there was a phrase that came to me as I was thinking about Susannah's paper earlier, and it's that the vocation of being human, which for me is the vocation of being a Christian, of which being trans is part, is about the lossful fullness of life. That the fullness of life has to be lossful. And that is actually a really positive notion. That sense of flourishing as about discovery, of letting go, of loss. A work of conversion, in effect. The acknowledgement that we are all the half-healed. That we are the half-healed and the half-converted in community and in person. And that God's image, the imago Dei and the likeness of Christ is this performative and indicative matter, rather than a static or given or constative matter. I think one of the things that I'd love to hear Susannah talk about a bit more, if I was offering some challenge, is about the importance and the priority of persons, because I think that there's something lurking in the paper that wasn't quite foregrounded as it might in this talk about, body, minds and souls. I think as theologians, and perhaps, I don't know, I'm no scientist, but I hope as scientists too, those of you who are scientists, that as theologians we're serious about persons and persons in unity, in community. And why do I say that? Because we're a Trinitarian faith. And we take seriously, don't we, the notion of personhood, the three persons who are yet one in the Godhead. And I think when we talk about persons, and of course, there's a whole, Greek Orthodox positions are very different in some ways to the Western Catholic take on this. And Susannah may want to comment on that. But when we talk about persons, there's a sort of, arguably a sense of a liberation from the obsession with attributes determining us, or certainly outward sex characteristics, for example, determining what identity is. So I'd love to hear her reflect a little bit more on that. But very finally, there is a daring in what Susannah says, I think. A daring which I think should challenge us, whether we are advocates of scientific method or theological exploration. And the daring is to suggest that there is a kind of holiness in precarity, in precariousness, and sometimes in transitoriness. And it's very clear to me that, and I say this as someone who has been pathologized in my own life and has spent, when I transitioned in my early 20s, if you read Dazzling Darkness, you sort of hear about my experience of psychiatry and a psychiatrist, etc., and how that was a very mixed bag. But that sense of, when we look for etiology, when we look for causation, what is this about? Where is this coming from? It can tempt us into pathologization. And I think that there is something really interesting and disruptive about saying, what if when we are exploring etiology, we pay attention to the gift of the transitory rather than something that is absolutely fixed and given for all time and can be populated with determinative meaning. So we're talking about mystery. And I love, very finally, this notion of living as I did in the midst of dysphoria, which is always characterized etymologically as pain, as a kind of impatience with a situation, a transformation into euphoria. That notion of euphoria as carrying well. And wouldn't it be extraordinary if we could model, as transformative creatures in our transness and in our formation, this holy carrying of painful truth that is not to be ignored, because sometimes that is just part of the facts, but that there is a gift of grace that we can all tune into in the mystery of God. That means we carry it well. And thank you, Susannah, for helping me tonight understand that I can be euphoric about being trans. Thank you.
And thank you, Rachel, for that very rich response. Now, we have quite a number of questions building up, and I'd like to encourage people to continue to use the Q&A to add more questions and comments. But just for a few moments, it would be really interesting to hear, Susannah, your response to Rachel's response, some of the challenges as well, if you feel happy to do so, please.
I'm always very happy to talk to Rachel for much longer than we have. Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really beautiful to hear, and yeah, really appreciate the kind of generosity and kind of closeness with which you engage with what I said. Yeah, this question of givenness is really important, isn't it? It's really key, because actually I think it's at the bedrock of quite a lot of the clash, really, quite a lot of the tension between people who hold that that gender transition is just beyond the licit limits of what it's open to humans to do, you know, what humans kind of can do, because it seems to be kind of rejecting something that God has given, something that God has done. I mean, there's so much brilliant theological writing that's been done on gift, and I won't rehearse it all now, but part of the nature of gift is that it doesn't usually have strings attached to it, or at least when it does have strings attached to it, we think of it perhaps as a bit of a poison chalice. And so the fact that we've been given something, I think, doesn't undermine the idea that actually we have a certain liberty, we have a certain flexibility with what we do with it, and perhaps that there is not only one kind of licit thing to do with a gift. But I find it really interesting, actually, that this language of givenness comes up not just from those people who are saying gender transition is illegitimate. It's the body that is kind of given and irreducible and kind of unchangeable. But actually, lots and lots of trans people also will talk about identity as given and something irreducible and something non-negotiable. So I find it really interesting that concept is kind of coming up. I don't want to say on both sides, but you know what I mean. It's coming up in various places. So the difference of perspective seems to be, is it the body which is being seen as the kind of bedrock and the thing that can't be changed, or is it something else? I'll also say that clearly, you know, I don't need to say this to you, but I'll kind of say it more broadly because lots of people are listening. Bodies are not unimportant to trans people, right? If bodies were unimportant, I think there would be a lot less dysphoria than there is. Really important to say that, of course, not all trans people experience dysphoria, but many do. You know, we all want to feel at home in our bodies, whoever we are, cis, trans. This comes up in discussions of kind of chronic illness and chronic pain and stuff you've written about yourself as well. But I think, you know, one thing to say would be identity certainly can feel just as irreducible as bodies can, and this sense of givenness kind of comes up a lot. Thank you also for kind of bringing in the question of vocation, and that's something you've written about lots yourself also. There is lots and lots of writing by trans priests that I really value, kind of reflecting on vocation, on call, and Justin Tannis, who I know you will know his work very well, but others may not. Justin Tannis is someone who's written a lot about this idea of gender as vocation, gender as calling, not just for trans people, but for everyone, that actually everyone is being continually called to live more faithfully, more kind of wholly into what God is calling them to be. And Justin Tannis notes that, you know, when Christians talk about vocation, talk about calling, sometimes we might think of that as something which just happens once and is over and done with, but not always. Quite often that's something that emerges quite slowly over time. It might not be obvious at first that is what God is saying to you. He also points out, which I think is really, really key, that vocation can be something lifelong, but not always. It can be for a particular time. It can be for a particular season of life. And that if we got more comfortable, perhaps, thinking about gender in these sort of terms, that could do some really important work for us. Yeah, thank you for kind of the appeal to personhood as well. You're right, that wasn't kind of named in there as much as it should be, and I could sort of say, well, of course that was implicit in everything, but I think it's always worth the reminder there. I spoke a little bit about Al McFadyen and his work in theological anthropology, which I really value, and something else which I kind of take from his work is a reminder that, you know, communities can be amazing places of affirmation of the personhood of others, but they're not always. You know, communities can also be places which deeply undermine the personhood of others, either kind of implicitly or by explicitly failing to recognize it and failing to affirm it. So one way around that, I suppose, could be that we say, well, it's our identity in God that is most primary, rather than, you know, the identity of ours that is recognized or not by our communities. But I'm really aware that that's very double-edged. Saying that our identity in God is the most primary, and that whatever is going on kind of here in this realm is just provisional, there's something really attractive about that, but there's something quite dangerous about it, I think, as well, because actually it means that sometimes someone can say to a trans person, well, don't you know that actually your body's not that important? You know, your real identity is in God. What's going on in your body isn't that important. So why can't you just make peace with your body as it is? And that I think doesn't do justice to the immense dysphoria that some trans people, not all, but that some trans people do feel. I could carry on talking, but I won't, because I want to know what everybody else has got to say. But thank you so much, Rachel. Really appreciate your response.
It's been an honour. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Susannah and Rachel. So I'll turn to some of the questions that are coming from the audience on the Q&A. There's quite a variety of different things being brought up here. This is a fairly broad question, perhaps less controversial than some, though. Well, I'll see what you think. This is a kind of interfaith question. Of course, you gave a very Christian talk, Susannah. This question asks about transformation. So if transformation is found across Christian traditions, as you said earlier on, how is transformation seen in non-Christian traditions? How does gender and the kind of trans issues that we've been talking about, how do they relate?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. You're right, absolutely. I was just talking about Christianity, and should probably acknowledge that at the outset, because this is the Science and Religion Forum, not just the Science and Christianity Forum. So apologies to anyone for whom it wasn't quite what they were expecting. One of the things I find really interesting is that the stuff that I'm doing at the moment, the sort of research I'm doing at the moment, is around transgender and gender diversity specifically. But one of the ways that I came to this was through my research on intersex and variant sex characteristics and kind of diversities of biological sex also. And when I was doing that work, kind of looking not just within Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism, one of the things that really, really interested me was I suppose I could say the lack of anxiety that there was within both Judaism and Islam about the fact that unusual sex gender configurations have always happened, have happened across various times and cultures and societies. And that in both those traditions, so in Judaism and Islam, I think more so than in Christianity, for a long time, for many centuries, there's been legal recognition, there's been kind of social recognition of people who sort of don't fit into a binary gender system. The labels don't necessarily always map quite comfortably onto, what we might now call gender diversity, what we might now call intersex, and so on. But there's a recognition, a really widespread recognition. There are particular sort of religious duties. There are particular rules for people who fit into a variety of categories. If we think about sort of Judaism, for example, and look at some of the rabbinic texts, there is really, really close recognition of people with a variety of gender identities and people with a variety of manifestations of physical sex. And there's been some really fascinating work done by people kind of trying to say, which present day intersex condition, for example, do we think that this particular rabbinic category might map onto? So I've done not a lot actually, but I've done a little bit of musing about why that might be. And one reason perhaps why there's been kind of less discussion, less talk about that stuff in Christianity than I think there has been in some other traditions, is that with the exception of certain areas like priesthood in lots of Christian traditions, I think there's been less sense that there are particular things that males can do and particular things that females can do, particular duties, particular responsibilities. That might be part of it. I think there is also something to do with, I guess the kind of edges of what we think constitutes of what we think constitutes human personhood. So, Judaism obviously shares with Christianity this affirmation that humans are made in the image of God. And those of you that have kind of done any reading or any work on the early chapters of Genesis will know that kind of within the Genesis creation narratives, there's some really interesting ways of reading that. And there's disagreement again among the rabbinic writers, for example, on whether the kind of original primal human was kind of androgynous and sexless. Does whether human kind of binary sex itself, in fact, only sort of really arises as a result of the fall. So the extent to which all of that is kind of part of the original divine plan and so on. So yeah, appeals to transformation kind of pop up all over the place. I will say that I think that I've only talked about Islam and Judaism, but those are examples of traditions where actually this stuff has been under discussion for a long time. There has been recognition that it happens, kind of fairly unhysterical recognition that it happens. Now, I will say that in some cases, particularly kind of today, if we look at somewhere like Iran, for example, in some ways Iran looks like it has a really, really progressive kind of outlook on gender variant people. So things like state-funded transition surgery and so on for gender variant people. What lots of commentators have suggested is that is not coming from a place of real kind of enlightenment about gender diversity. Actually, it's coming from a place of real suspicion about homosexuality, and that actually if you are attracted to someone of the same biological sex as you, it is better to say, well, really you're a member of the opposite gender, rather than to say really someone could be attracted to somebody of the same physical sex. So it's a bit double-edged, and things are not always quite as they look on the surface, but yeah, this stuff is discussed widely. And I'm rambling now, so I'll stop, I think, and we'll take another question.
Thank you. Yeah, here is another question. This looks as though it's dealing with some of the tensions that can arise in Christian community here. How would you respond to the idea that Christians are responsible for affirming others as they are, particularly enabling our children to be comfortable in their own skin?
I'm not really sure where that question's coming from, so I'll try and answer it in two ways, because I think that question, and I don't know if the person wants to sort of put any clarification or context, I guess that question could be coming from a place of saying it's really, really important that children are kind of are encouraged to tell the truth as they see it about the world around them. There is lots and lots of anxiety at the moment about sort of gender affirming practices in primary schools in particular. So when kind of quite young children are transitioning socially in this country, it would only be a social transition when we're talking about primary school age, but whether that ends up being confusing for other children who perhaps knew somebody as a boy and now they know them as a girl, or vice versa. So I think the question could be coming from a place of saying, is it not important as Christians that actually we do justice to people's own kind of self-identity? I think, though, that there may be a hint in it also of questions about what happens when truths seem to clash, or perceived truths seem to clash. There have been some quite high-profile legal cases recently where it's not always Christians necessarily, although sometimes it has been Christians who have said, do I not have the right to say that actually I believe that God only makes people male or female, and that it's not legitimate to transition gender? If someone has transitioned, do I not have the right to, for example, continue to call them a male if they were born biologically male? Do I not have the right to continue to call them by male pronouns if I think they're really a male, and so on? I guess for me, all of that stuff would come down to the fact that that truth is really, really important, but truth is not uncomplicated. Truth is not uncontroversial always, and that actually if someone has asked me to use a particular name and particular pronouns for them, it's kind of loving and it's courteous to do that, just as I want people to use the name and pronouns that I introduced myself to them with. There's some really important work that's been done kind of philosophically in this whole area on, well, a couple of people that I could talk about. So one is Miranda Fricker, who uses a concept of epistemic testimonial injustice. So basically, this is the idea that some people's accounts of themselves are taken less seriously than others, and that if someone has decided ahead of time that there is something about you that makes you untrustworthy, they're not necessarily going to take seriously what you tell them about yourself. And this is kind of been picked up and used quite a lot in trans discourse, because of a sense among some people that a trans person must inherently be mentally ill or mentally disturbed or deluded or something along those lines, because a healthy, well-adjusted person just couldn't have a trans identity, and therefore because that person is kind of disturbed or disrupted or deluded in some way, their account of themselves, their understanding of themselves, is in itself kind of suspect. And there's been some really important work kind of sort of pushing back at that. Another philosopher also who's written lots in this area, Talia May Betcher, who talks about the importance of kind of first person testimony, and says that when someone tells us something about themselves, we usually believe them unless we've got a compelling reason not to. There might be compelling reasons not to believe what somebody tells us about themselves, but generally in everyday life, if you tell me your arm's hurting, I'm not going to say to you, no, it isn't. Why would I do that? That would just be a weird thing to do. And what it comes down to again is whether there is something about the very experience of gender diversity or gender dysphoria, which in itself is undermining somebody's right to be taken seriously as a knower and as able to communicate something about themselves. Something I find really interesting in a lot of, so it rises in kind of conservative Roman Catholic discussions of transgender. It arises also in some conservative evangelical Protestant accounts of transgender, a sense that the person who is kind of suspicious or circumspect about transition has access to kind of better knowledge, truer knowledge about someone's identity than the person has themselves, because of, for example, what they interpret the Bible to say about the kind of the binary nature and the fixed nature of human sex. Yeah, there's something interesting about that, but I think it doesn't always acknowledge the kind of contested and constructive nature of the webs that all of us are operating within. You know, none of us is coming at this out of the context of a society, out of the context of a culture. So, as I said, I wasn't quite sure which angle that question was coming from, but I hope that the questioner has found something useful in that response.
Thanks, Susannah. Yes, I didn't have any further context, but yeah, thank you. I'm going to here's a question about identity, because that was what you were touching on towards the end of your answer. And I'm going to interpolate my own thought into this as well. So, and of course, you brought up autism around halfway through your talk, and I was, one of the things I think I learned from you, please correct me if I got this wrong, is that just as we might speak about autism in terms of a spectrum, and that we're all on the spectrum, it might be appropriate to speak about transgender in terms of a spectrum as well, that we are all on somewhere. So talking about personal identity and those who identify as non-trans, what do you think that they learn, or what's the most important thing they learn from the emergent identity question that is arising here?
Yes, I would. Thank you. I guess I'd go back to something I was sort of saying right at the beginning, and something that Rachel has touched on also, which is this idea of the kind of doubleness of all of us as humans. So you sort of noted earlier, Mark, at the moment I'm working on a book on gender diversity specifically. My previous book, which came out in 2017, Unfamiliar Theology, I was thinking about this more broadly in the context of our ideas, and again, this was coming from a Christian theological perspective, our ideas as Christian theologians about the models of family, about the models of marriage and parenting and all kinds of things like that we've kind of inherited within our cultures. And what I suggested was that any of us who are within a particular tradition, be that a religious tradition or a particular kind of cultural tradition, there are things about being in that tradition which we almost take on involuntarily because we've been initiated into them in some way. They sort of might have their claws in us in various ways. You know, just as we all inherit various things from our own families of rearing, kind of particular dynamics, particular ways of operating, and so on. But as we grow up, we've got some decisions to make about whether we want to kind of keep the patterns that have been given to us, or whether there are things we want to change. Now, sometimes it's very obvious to us that certain things that have happened in our families of rearing perhaps are toxic and not things we want to repeat or perpetuate. And what I was suggesting in that book is that actually the same goes culturally and religiously and so on, that just because we are within a particular tradition doesn't mean that, you know, we kind of pass it on exactly as it came to us, because we never could actually, because in owning it, in practicing it, I use the image of curation, as Rachel noted, we're always sifting, we're always making decisions about, you know, what are the non-negotiables, what is the bedrock, what are the things that perhaps are more peripheral and less important. You know, sometimes that's going on consciously, sometimes it isn't. And all of this, I think, is going on as we negotiate our genders as well. And that's the case whether we identify as someone with gender dysphoria, or someone for whom there is a disjunction between the sex assigned at birth and their gender identity, or not. Even those of us that perhaps, you know, would say we feel fairly comfortable, you know, to all intents and purposes fitting into a binary gender system, I think will often say, well, yeah, of course there's things about it that aren't great. Of course there are things that are problematic. Of course there are things I want to push back at. You know, we could think of it, I think, in terms of clusters, and actually the same would be true for biological sex also. We could think about sort of poles with clusters at either end, but as you've said, Mark, a kind of spectrum and various sort of points in between as well. So I think, you know, for people who are cisgender, which is a term that some people like to use and others really dislike, but for people who are kind of not transgender, I think a recognition that actually we are still all doing this negotiation. Lots and lots of you will know of Judith Butler's work, and the book of hers that people always go back to is now 30 years old, Gender Trouble from 1990. And I think one of the things that is most misunderstood really from that book is Butler's discussion of gender as performance, because I think what people often think Butler is saying is that gender as performance means that you're doing that really consciously, that you sort of wake up and say, right, what gender am I performing today, and how am I doing that, and I'm going to put on my lipstick and perform femininity and so on. And what Butler is saying is it's actually more complicated than that. These are webs of performance that we are all caught up in, but very, very often we don't recognize that it is a performance. Actually, we think there is something real there. We think that putting on lipstick is kind of communicating something really kind of real and irreducible, rather than communicating, you know, a particular set of cultural conventions that people may be more or less happy fitting into. So I think I would say, actually, all of us, whatever our gender identity, have got a responsibility about the messages that we are passing on, you know, be it about kind of power, be it about authority, be it about violence, all kinds of things. And it's not just people that feel obviously unhappy about that situation who've got the responsibility to kind of push back at the bits that we think are toxic. You know, if those of us who are cisgender think there are things about a binary gender system which are really damaging, it is just as much, if not more so, our responsibility to critique those, rather than leaving it to people who, you know, perhaps are already rather put upon because of their own gender identity.
Great, thank you, Susannah. We've only got a few minutes left now, so we probably only have time for one more question, and so apologies to those of you who have asked questions that I haven't got to. But let's address this last question, which has a name attached to it, actually. This comes from Finn, who is our GDPR and safeguarding officer. He's asked, is there a link between hesitancy to recognise diversity and concern that this breaches the easy demarcation of heterosexual marriage, especially if one takes intersex bodies to the ultimate conclusion, i.e. it's either about chromosomes or not? And Finn has added another clause on this, in which case a trans woman couldn't marry a cis man, even though on appearance this is more okay than a cis gay wedding. I'm not quite sure what Finn is getting at the end, but I think he's asking really about, you know, the hesitancy to recognise diversity and concern that this might breach some kind of demarcation in heterosexual marriage.
Yeah, I know we've only got a few minutes, so I'll try and be really brief. I always hate it when people say, buy my book and read it, because I address it there. And you can't buy it because it's not published yet. But in the book, when it is published, I've got a chapter where I deal with questions around what is sometimes called gender fraud. So there's been quite a few cases over the last 10 years or so with people who basically took their former partners to court for essentially misleading them by basically having made them think that they were a different biological sex from what they were. And there's all kinds of really interesting stuff in there around burdens of disclosure and what someone is and is not beholden to disclose to someone else. In all the cases that I'm thinking of, there was no question that the sexual activity hadn't been consensual. The person had consented to sexual activity, but subsequently they said, well, I didn't know who I was consenting to have sex with because I thought you were a boy and you turned out to be a girl, or vice versa. So I'll say there's some really interesting kind of legal scholarship that's been done around that stuff. In terms of marriage, it's really, really interesting because I'll talk about the Church of England because that's my tradition. In the Church of England, clergy are not obliged to perform a marriage if they think that one or indeed both of the spouses may have transitioned gender, but they're not barred from doing so. So they can do that. And there was an interesting question at the General Synod just end of 2019, I think, just before the pandemic, about that basically, and about whether that meant that the Church of England was recognising essentially that same-sex marriage was possible and licit in a very limited circumstance, even if it kind of didn't generally. The question mentioned intersex, and yeah, it's a really, really live issue there. I did some empirical work with intersex Christians a few years ago, and one of the things that one of them said, so this was 2011, so it was just before same-sex marriage was legalized in England and Wales. And one of the people I spoke to said she had a condition where she had female external genitalia, kind of breasts and hips and a very female body shape, but XY chromosomes and internal testes. And she said, what would the church do with somebody like me? Who would they tell me that I should marry? Chromosomally, I'm male, but in every other respect, I'm female. Are they going to say to me, you've got to marry a woman because you've got XY chromosomes, when that is going to look very much like a lesbian wedding, and they're not going to like that at all? So I think it basically drives home that lots of the things that we perhaps think are really obvious and self-evident are always a bit more complicated than we have thought they were, and that therefore it's worth kind of saying, what are the real non-negotiables? What are the real irreducibles? Do we really want to follow this to its logical conclusion? I'm going to stop there because it's 9 o'clock and I think we might all disappear into the ether or be raptured or something. But thank you very much, everybody, for the questions. Sorry for those we didn't get to. And thank you so much again, Rachel. And thank you to the committee for having me.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Susannah, for all that you've given us here, and Rachel too, for all your thoughts and perspectives on this. This has been a really rich lecture. I've certainly myself learned a lot, and I actually, as a footnote, I was delighted to hear the Book of Common Prayer used positively in a talk on transgender theology. So that was a real pleasure for me. So thank you so much for an excellent Gowland lecture, and it'd be great to see you again sometime. So I think we're going to stop the recording now and say goodbye to everyone.